Welcome to SBCN's Activate Your Impact 2022 Nonprofit Policy Summit. And for those of you who are with us this morning, welcome back. My name is Dana L. Neal. I'm SBCN's Learning and Member Engagement Director, and I'm excited to kick off this session, Housing Policy A to Z, What Nonprofits Need to Know in 2022. Before we invite our speakers up, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that each of us are on today. I think it's particularly appropriate on this conversation about housing. So here in San Jose, we are living, learning, and organizing on the land of the Muwekma and Tamiya and Ohlone tribes. Together, let us commit to educating ourselves and advocating for Indigenous people and those who are displaced globally. I know people here are tuning in from different areas, so I encourage you to learn about what land you are living on by using the website that we will drop in the chat. With that, while I go through some guidelines for the summit, we'd love to learn who's in the room with us. Please introduce yourselves by sending your name, your title, your organization, your pronouns, and the land that you are on in the chat. Marielle will recap that for you all. We encourage you to share AYI on social media by using the hashtags AYI22, Activate Your Impact, and Driving Fearless Advocacy, and tagging SBCN and our presenters wherever you post. Next, for accessibility purposes, we do have automated closed captioning feature in Zoom activated. With this, you have the ability to move the captions around on your screen. You can disable them entirely, and so do whatever's comfortable for you. You can reference the bar at the bottom of your Zoom, click on live transcript on the right, and click hide subtitles if you want to hide that. If you're having tech or other troubles during this session, please feel free to DM me directly. Thank you to our sponsors, First Five of Santa Clara County, the San Francisco Foundation, Destination Home, Stanford Children's Health, El Camino Health, Santa Clara Family Health Plan, Kaiser Permanente, and Healthier Kids Foundation for making this event possible. All of our speakers are excited to hear your questions. Please feel free to use the chat function to send your questions both during the panel and at the end, where hopefully we might have some time for some Q&A. But we do ask folks to please remain on mute for the duration of the program unless prompted otherwise. Once again, this meeting is being recorded for registrants and those who couldn't make it today or may want to watch later on. And with that, let's go ahead and dive in and welcome our facilitator for today, SBCN's own CEO, Kira Kazantzis, and our speakers. So we have Nadia Aziz, Housing Directing Attorney at the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley, Jen Loving, CEO of Destination Home, and Mathew Reed, Director of Policy at SB at Home.
Thank you, Dana, and thanks to our panelists. So what you're going to hear today is a fast-paced overview about what's happening in housing and housing policy today in Santa Clara County, with a pretty heavy focus on San Jose. And our time is super limited, so we're going to dive right in. And I'm going to hand it to Jen Loving, who's going to kick us off with some table setting about what's happening in the housing policy world and what's the current atmosphere here in Santa Clara County on housing and housing affordability. Jen.
Thanks, Kara. Thanks, SBCN, for always hosting such important panels. I've been asked to talk a little bit about like the landscape that we're facing right now, and in so many ways, it's never been more important. With an election season, with a year of having an election, and especially a mayoral race, you forget almost how heightened and fraught the discourse becomes about housing and homelessness. And frankly, I have felt the amount of disinformation has been at an all-time high. And we have a long way to go still for the rest of the election season. And it's coupled with having former elected officials running for offices at other jurisdictions, people that are currently in office that are running. And so in some ways it outsizes the platform that people have to basically say what they want to when they might be wanting to make shots about a candidate. They're using homelessness and housing as a political football. And a couple of examples. There's lately been a big discourse around building more interim units, which is great. Building more interim units, having more people that are experiencing homelessness have a place to go quicker that is not congregate shelter, which we've learned during COVID is frankly could be very bad for people's health in terms of not being able to isolate and quarantine. And so these modular units or converting hotels or motels, these are all good things. But where we get a little nutty is when we start comparing it to things like permanent housing, we start weighing that, oh, we should only do these modulars because they're faster and cheaper, as if cheap is always needs to be the bottom line when you're talking about solving problems for people that are experiencing homelessness or for the lowest income folks in our community. And it's also comparing to the cost, that it's so much cheaper than what it costs to build a permanent home, which, you know, it's not a comparison. We're talking about very small 6x6, 8x8 units that may or may not even have in-suite bathrooms. They don't have kitchens. It's a better shelter, and we should be doing those things, but comparing it to permanency and comparing the cost, or even worse, vilifying building permanent housing as if the majority of people that are suffering here don't just really truly need a place that they live in that they can afford. It's really concerning. And for people that don't understand or not so immersed in this space, to hear things like, well, we can do this cheaper and faster, so we should take the money from here and put it over here. We shouldn't want to do permanent housing because it takes too long, is manipulating sort of the whole reasoning behind why people are homeless in the first place. And so seeing things and headlines, and even this week, I got a newsletter that said nothing is being done. Nonprofits, county officials, nothing is being done. I mean, and you read that and you think that is like hard to comprehend. When you have facts that say that in the last 22 months, since January 2020, we've permanently housed almost 6,000 people. And when I say we, I mean the system. That's dozens of nonprofit organizations, many who are on this call, all of the work with our public sector partners, people who are groups that provide services, almost 6,000 people. I mean, that is a magnitude, frankly, that probably rivals just about any other jurisdiction in the country outside of places like LA and New York. And so being able to know like what's true, homelessness is exploding is another headline I see in journalism. I hear it coming from elected officials' mouths. There's no data that says homelessness is exploding. What we know, based on the coordinated entry system that has been operating for 6 or 7 years now in this community, that we've actually had 33% less people become homeless in the last 22 months, 33% less. So why does it feel like homelessness is so much worse? And there's a variety of reasons for that. The landscape of how encampments have been managed during the pandemic has changed. People have moved and the more rural areas and come up to areas that are more visible. So definitely feels like you feel like there's a lot of homelessness, but the data is not necessarily demonstrating an explosion. But we keep hearing that. We hear nothing's being done. So sorry, nothing is being done. Homelessness is exploding, and it creates this mythology of disinformation, like we don't know what we're doing, and we must throw out everything that we're doing and start over, which is really undercutting a couple of decades of actual housing policy, things like Measure A, which has already added 41 new developments for the lowest income, poorest, formerly homeless folks in our community. Things that are really good policy decisions and trying to help address the supply of the deepest level of affordability. And so I guess what I would say is if it feels like you're hearing things that don't make sense, I go back to, well, what's the political landscape? How are we trying to score points right now? Why is it important to undercut or to say that nothing's happening? Because it's important to be able to gain and score points for the campaign that you may be running. And so I think what we should do, or what we can do as nonprofits, is really try to hold our both the elected officials and people wanting to be in these really important seats accountable. Make sure that we're reflecting back to them the facts, confronting when something is like, that's not right. I mean, I certainly respond to the messages that I get when I hear that nonprofits aren't doing anything or nothing's being done. I always respond with, well, that's not true. Like, here's the facts. Generally, I find that doesn't really land, though. Facts aren't seeming to matter as much over the last few months, and I don't know how much they're going to matter through November. But I think it's really important for all of us to continue to be truth tellers, and also just really know that you are doing tremendous work. Those of you that are doing work in the space are doing a tremendous job, and not to be swayed or diminished by some of the things that you're hearing right now. So I'll pause there, Kira.
Okay, thanks, Jen. So in the context of this reality where there's maybe not as much truth being told as we would hope, and also having our kind of work questioned and what we see in front of us and our eyes, it would help to understand these kind of broader goals of the people who are advocating for housing for all. And so I think maybe Nadia, can you help us with kind of a policy framework that would help us just understand what the goals are, and then we can hold those up against what these things that we're hearing that Jen's talking about?
Yeah, for sure. So I don't know if this slide is up. I can't really tell. But yeah, like Jen said, when we're living in an age of disinformation, we got to focus on the facts. And so in our housing world, we talk a lot about the 3 Ps. And this is how we go and tackle the housing crisis, and this is how we work to solve it. And the 3 Ps came out of a Bay Area wide process called CASA, where all the stakeholders were brought into the room to think about how to solve the housing crisis. And the 3 Ps are production of rental housing for low-income individuals. So we have to produce more housing. We have to create more housing that's accessible to people who are low income. Preservation of affordable housing. So we have to preserve the affordable housing that already does exist. And when we talk about affordable housing, it's not just, low-income tax credit properties or what we think about when we think about affordable housing, but also thinking about naturally occurring affordable housing, places like mobile homes, which are really the last bastion of affordable home ownership for a lot of families in Silicon Valley. And we also have to protect tenants from displacement and to prevent them from actually getting into homelessness. And these are things like just cause eviction, rent control, and rent stabilization, getting legal services so people can put up a fight when it comes to facing eviction. So these are all, we have to embrace all of these strategies if we want to solve the housing process. We can't just focus on one or the other. And so some of the policy things that we're talking about today, some of the solutions, they're all going to fall into one of these three buckets. So yeah, I don't know if anyone on the panel wanted to add anything about the 3 Ps, but this is really like the key framework that we use when we're talking about how we look at solving the housing crisis.
Okay, thanks, Nadia. Well, let's dive into one of those or more than one of those 3 Ps. Mathew, you're next. Mathew's going to be talking to us about something called COPA, which is being discussed statewide and specifically in the city of San Jose. Mathew, what on earth is COPA and why is it important?
Right, COPA is it stands for Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. And I'm gonna, because I think it's new to a lot of folks, I'm gonna go in a little more detail and tell you how it works. But it's what we're discussing in San Jose is essentially modeled on existing successful programs in San Francisco and Washington, DC, and is kind of hopefully bringing the best parts of each to the table. But essentially, this is how it works. Community-based organizations are given a right of first offer when a property owner decides they want to sell a rental property. The qualified organizations could be partnerships, which include tenants, nonprofit developers, community organizations. The city provides some acquisition and rehabilitation support, hopefully leveraging other resources that exist for affordable housing. And the property is purchased and becomes permanent affordable housing. So this is the naturally occurring housing stock that Nadia was talking about. It really tends to be older properties, but they're the ones where the vast majority of lower income folks live in the city, because we just don't have enough affordable housing right now to meet everybody's needs. So it's critical that we don't lose this piece of the puzzle. Next slide. So what does it do? It is a preservation strategy by shifting to community nonprofit ownership with permanent affordability. Ideally, it prevents displacement of lower income renters who are in these properties who tend to get priced out when they change hands. It preserves this housing stock and provides stability to the households and the communities. It empowers tenants by really engaging them in the process and putting them at the center of the decisions. Ideally, it provides an opportunity to support home ownership and other asset building opportunities that don't exist in traditional affordable housing programs. And it protects rental housing from speculative investment by keeping it in the community. If I don't know, maybe it's just me, if you read the newspaper, there are these major national investors who are stockpiling massive amounts of money to swoop in and purchase vulnerable rental properties, whether they're small apartment buildings or single family homes. And the goal is to upend some of that process to keep these controlled locally. Next slide. So, but what makes it part of a larger policy project? By working through community and tenants and established nonprofit housing organizations, the goal is to begin to build out a preservation infrastructure in the South Bay. We talk about the 3 Ps. We've always struggled to figure out what that middle P preservation means. And so this is the beginning of building out that infrastructure that doesn't exist, and put emphasis on community control and ownership through that process. It creates opportunities for new models. That's a typo, I apologize. New models of development and approaches to acquisition and ownership, including supporting community development corporations, land trusts, co-ops. This is a whole part of the industry and the solutions that we just don't have this developed. And it provides an opportunity to support emerging tenant movement in the South Bay. So this is why it's part of larger policy goals that we have to, again, as Nadia said, sort of create the tools that we need to comprehensively address the housing crisis. Next slide. So how do we get here? Where are we going? It's important to acknowledge that preserving existing housing that is more affordable is a priority. As you said, it's been on the table for a long time and was really highlighted and has been adopted in numerous policy positions that the city has taken. The San Jose City Council in September of 2020, as part of its anti-displacement strategy, identified COPA as a piece of work that staff should be engaged with. And there have been months, literally months, of community engagement on both a city track and a community track. And so this is one of the most discussed and engaged with policy items that's come before council in my time. So the details are still in play. I believe that there are links that will be dropped in the chat to the city's website on COPA, which has a lot more information, and to the COPA Community Coalition's website, which also has more information. There will be some additional discussion that I believe SVCN will be hosting. I think the target date, Kara, is March 2nd. And again, we're expecting this to come back late March or early April to council.
Yes. I do have a follow-up question, and,
Sure.
and Mathew, you can answer it, and or Jen or Nadia, who is in the mood. And I would just invite also, if anyone has any questions right now about this COPA thing, or what Nadia said about the 3 Ps, or what Jen said about our current environment, go ahead and put those in the chat. We'll read them out when we can, and see if the panel can answer them. So my question is kind of like Jen was talking about these, emails and stuff we're getting from different candidates. I got a flyer in the mail that claims that COPA means that small mom and pop landowners are going to have to wait months to sell their property because of if we adopt this rule. And because this is a major intervention into what is a very hot housing market, it's socialist. Not, we don't have to get into like the definition of socialism here, but like, how do you combat that flyer?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. You know, there are a lot of folks that have been pushing back on this recently, but it's been going on for a while. And unfortunately, some of them were pretending to be participating in these community discussions in good faith and meanwhile sort of sabotaging the discussion by putting out disinformation. So nobody has to sell their property to anybody. Nobody's being asked to sell their property at below market value. It's really just an initial period to give community groups that are interested in pursuing broader public benefits and public needs to have a bite at the apple. So the you know, the history on this is that it when it works well, it's as efficient as the market is. And can actually be even more stable. But again, nobody is being asked to sell at below market value or being told to whom to sell to. The control always continues to be with the property owner. It's just an opportunity to open the discussion.
And I just want to add, I mean, I think what we have to also keep in mind is this is about addressing the racial wealth gap that exists and continues to exist in this country. And so it's really important for us to recognize that when we're talking about who will benefit from a COPA, it's the people who live and work in our community and people of color who have for so long been intentionally been taken out of the homeownership and the ability to gain wealth through homeownership. So just wanted to add.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, we believe that for, you know, forever, oh, it's too hard. Oh, you know, it's too expensive. Oh, these, you know, these people don't have, it's time to just say yes. I mean, we need to open this door and we need to start doing the work. And as Nadia said, we have a long history of saying no to communities. It's time for us to commit to empowering them.
All right, I don't see any questions in chat yet. All right, back to Nadia. Another cryptic term, housing element. Decode this for us.
Yes, so I like to call myself like the Martinian of housing element. So if I can do it, like anyone can do housing element. So it sounds like super complicated, but it's not. And it's a really, really important way for all of us in the nonprofit world to get engaged and involved in housing policy. So what is the housing element? So every city has a general plan that's basically like the roadmap or the outline of their city or their jurisdiction. And the state of California has a law that says that the housing element of the general plan has to be developed every 7 years. And you know, the housing element essentially plans how housing should look in the next, you know, 7 years or more time than that. But it has to be approved by the state. And so right now is the time that all of the Bay Area cities are looking at their housing elements, and they all need to be approved by the state by January 2023. ABAG, which is the Association of Bay Area Governments, allocates what's called a regional housing needs allocation to each city. So I think the number for San Jose, for example, is about 68,000 units that they have to account for. Someone correct me if I'm wrong on that number. And they have to talk about in their housing element how they're going to plan for housing at all different levels: low income, very low income, above market, people who are at market level. And it's really a blueprint for future development. So it requires, you know, you to analyze where housing goes, what programs and policies exist, what barriers exist to housing. So it's a very technical document, but also there's opportunity. And if you go to the next slide, I can talk about that a little bit more, for community to engage. Because as part of the housing element, there's a mandatory public participation component, which means that the cities have to listen to the community. The cities have to have some kind of public engagement process. So, you know, if you're plugged into your local jurisdiction, you can see you might get emails that say, housing element workshop or housing element stakeholder group. These are all opportunities for you all to get involved in trying to shape how housing looks in your community. And as nonprofit leaders, we know that we all have a pulse on what's happening because we talk to people on a daily basis. The housing element also requires planning for housing at all income levels. So this is an opportunity for we all to advocate for more housing for low-income families, more housing for very low-income families, not just more, but where are you going to put it? Are there areas that are where there's racial and ethnic concentrations of poverty? Are there higher opportunity areas in the community? Where are you going to put your housing? The city actually has to actually have a list of potential sites. So they have to be very specific in the housing element. And not just where the housing goes, but also what are policies? They call it in the housing elements, it's called golden programs. But what policies does the city need to enact in order to overcome all these barriers people have to accessing housing? So, think about the community that you live in. I'm a tenant advocate. We have been advocating for many years for stronger tenant protections. That's a barrier that a lot of people have because they, pre the state legislation, people could get evicted for no reason. We're seeing that now. So, advocate with the city, say you should pass really strong tenant protections and put this in your housing element. So the things that you're passionate about, if you're passionate about foster youth, if you're passionate about, about remedying racial discrimination and racial segregation, these are all things that you can be advocating for as the cities go through the housing element process. You can go to the next slide. So one really important piece, one important thing that's now part of the housing element is the obligation for cities to affirmatively further fair housing. So 1968, Fair Housing Act gets passed. It prohibits discrimination against people based on their race. It's been amended to include things like national origin, religion, gender. In the state of California, it also includes gender identity and sexual orientation. So the obligation for cities to affirmatively further fair housing has existed since at least 1968. And what it means is that a city must take meaningful actions to combat discrimination and overcome patterns of discrimination and segregation that we know have existed forever and have been intentional. So for many, many years, cities were required to do what was called an analysis of impediments to fair housing, where they, looked at impediments to fair housing, impediments to access to fair housing, and submit it to HUD. The Obama administration made the obligation a little bit better, a little bit stronger. And then of course, Trump came and basically told cities they didn't have to do it. As a result, the state made it a requirement as part of the housing element to include this assessment of fair housing, which is part of the obligation to further fair housing. So what does that mean? That means that the city in this document has to address significant disparity in housing needs and access to opportunity. So where do people of color, where can they access housing? Where are they able to afford to live? What about people with disabilities? Where can they live? Are there barriers to people with disabilities? What about people who are queer? Are there specific barriers that exist for them? And then after they address these barriers, they have to replace, I'll just go through the list and talk about it. Replace segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns. Like, is your city segregated? How are you going to address that? Transform racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity. So how do you do this without displacement? So how do you look at areas where people are living, where it's been under-resourced, and bring those resources in without displacing people, and foster and maintain compliance with civil rights and fair housing laws. So how are you ensuring that people can, if they're being discriminated against, there's robust protections for them, and there's places that people can go, like whether it's the Law Foundation or Project Sentinel or other places that these agencies exist where people can go to complain. So as part of a housing element, all of this analysis needs to get done. And so all of these housing elements are due next January, and they have to include an assessment of fair housing. So what this means for all of us is that we got to keep an eye on what's happening with our cities and be advocating. Like, the time is now to start paying attention and to start thinking about, like, what are the things that we want to see. So yeah, so it's an exciting time. It's a fun time. This is my second housing element cycle. And I'm excited that, I can't believe it's already been 7 years, and I'm really excited to be doing this work.
So Nadia, you know, I'm thinking back to work we've done together and work that's come before us as well, on housing element. Like, when the housing elements for like the city of San Jose were passed, which is it's a big document basically, what did that activity lead to? So like, what have been the big policy successes that happened as a result of there being, like you said, a goal or a program being in this giant messy document?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, so, you know, okay, so from the lawyer perspective, I will just say this. The fun thing about housing element is that you can sue a city if they don't comply with their housing element. Karen knows all about this. You can ask her to tell you stories about it. But yeah, so in terms of advocating for policies, there's a lot of policies that, you know, Kira worked on, that I worked on, that you know, ended up being part of what ended up becoming law. One example is inclusionary zoning, which is, you know, requiring affordable housing when you're building housing, whether that's for sale or rental, that some of the units in a development actually include affordable units. So, you know, we're advocating to put that in the housing element, you know, like, you know, this is a barrier that people have. You know, there's market rate development being developed in higher opportunity areas. Let's put affordable housing in there. So by advocating for that in the housing element, then you get that in the housing element, and then you tell the city, hey, you put this in the housing element, now you got to do it. And so by doing that after years and years and years, you know, we're able to get San Jose to pass an inclusionary zoning ordinance. Same with source of income discrimination, or discriminating against people by saying that you can't rent to them, that you won't rent to them if they have a voucher. That's something that we as advocates were seeing was a big problem. And so we would advocate, put this in your housing element. This is a barrier for low-income people to be able to access housing, especially in higher opportunity areas. So, you know, it's something that we as advocates were like, you should put this in your housing element. And, you know, the city actually, you know, looking at some of the work they did around their their source of income discrimination ordinance, which passed, I believe in 2019, you know, they said, we put this in our housing element. This is something that we need to do. And, you know, it was part of the assessment of fair housing at that time as well. So those are two really important examples of work that was done, that advocates advocated for to be put into the housing element, that were actually implemented as policy.
Jen.
Nadia, you're so smart. I was wondering if I could ask you a hypothetical. Let's say hypothetically, we have a mayor or a candidate who wants to be the mayor, hypothetically, who thinks that putting a whole lot of homeless people in one place, say maybe the fairgrounds, how does that fly in the face of some of what we're talking here, or also some of these interim units that are on cloverleafs or the sides of the freeway? How did those propositions fit with this work that we're trying to do here?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say about that, Jen, but in terms when it comes to both the assessment of fair housing and the housing element, you have to assess where housing goes. And you also have to assess where places like transitional housing shelters, like where are they being put, and how that affects, you know, with the assessment of fair housing, what impact that has on people of color, on you know, people with disabilities. And so that's the analysis that we should demand that the cities do. Like where you want to place people in the fairgrounds, like what does that mean? How is that going to impact people who are poor? And so, if advocates aren't pushing the city to do that analysis, they're not going to do it. So it's something that I think we should be thinking about. The fair housing laws existed or were passed in order to combat segregation. We all know, like almost a lot of us read Color of Law, we know segregation was intentional, right? We know that people of color were intentionally excluded from higher opportunity areas. And so, we have to demand now that the city be intentional about how they're going to remedy that intentional segregation by really looking at what exists right now and how the policies are going to impact people of color and communities of color. And especially for us as nonprofit leaders, like we really should be pushing cities and pushing jurisdictions to listen to the community and listen to those people who traditionally don't have voices. I know, Destination Home has a lived experience advisory board, like you're very well versed in talking to people with lived experience. And it's our duty to make sure that the cities and the jurisdictions, from all over the place, we're talking about like places like where I live in Cupertino to Palo Alto, they all should be listening to the people who have lived experience, who can't access housing, who are unhoused, who are people of color, and making sure that their voices are the ones that are leading what gets placed in the housing element. And sorry, I'm gonna get off my soapbox a little bit.
Well, we put it out there for you to step on, so it's all good. All right. Any other questions or comments on housing element, Mathew, Jen, and Nadia, or audience?
I just have one. It's not going well. We're tracking this around the county. It's not going well. The direction from the state is no joke. This is what you got to do. This is why you got to do it. And it's just not being followed in the way that it was intended. And the experience in the first round in Southern California is that the state just isn't certifying housing elements until they get it much closer to right. So we're really asking people to be proactive. If you sit back and wait for a community meeting, they're going to give you kind of lofty stuff, and it's time to be really proactive about engagement. And frankly, you're going to get more that way in terms of progress, but you're also doing the cities a favor, because frankly, they're just unprepared to respond at the level that they're going to be required to. And so presenting options, presenting engagement with folks that they haven't been able to or haven't bothered to reach out to is really honoring the process. So I dropped a link in earlier to a toolkit that we have. We have a semi-regular newsletter we'd love to plug folks in, but things are really ramping up.
Great. And I'd
Just
also
to
say,
add to that, Matthew, I just wanted to say that, one voice goes a long way, but our voices will speak that volume of the source and volume that we need and everything that is to be discussed about fair housing. Just a little.
thank you. All right. Well, Mathew, now you're talking. It's your turn again. Talk to us about housing siting policy.
So this is related to Jen's question of how do we prioritize where we put our resources.
Oh, I'm going to ask it again when you give your.
And to Nadia's question about how do we commit to really expanding opportunities where historically we haven't created them. And just today at council, there's an item in the housing department had a notice of funding availability for new affordable housing projects. It was massive. I don't know if it's ever been so big. It was $150 million. They got applications from 19 projects that have been kind of waiting in the wings, chomping at the bit to get resources to get off the ground. And those 19 projects would cost $240 million to fund. So there's a tremendous demand for affordable housing resources. And there's folks that have been working hard to get projects off the ground. So this is related to that. This is a question of how does the city of San Jose use the affordable housing resources that it has to meet the broad range of interests that we have as a city. So in 2017, the staff was asked by council to review the affordable housing dispersion policy, which was an old policy that said we shouldn't have affordable housing all in one place.
Yeah, are those demands still priority?
I'm sorry, I can't see who's talking to me. What,
I
maybe?
was asking if those demands are still in priority as far as available housing.
You know, let me get through the presentation, and then maybe the question will make more sense when we get there. I'm not sure. I think the prioritization is a question, but the demand is significant. I think that was the point that I was making, was just that we struggle to have the resources, and we've known this forever, to meet the demand that exists. So staff came back last year and had a whole new policy. It was framed around the idea that we should look at this question of affirmatively furthering fair housing that Nadia brought up, to figure out how to expand access to high opportunity areas, but also to better serve historically underserved neighborhoods in the city. When it went to council, though, expecting to be approved, council sent the policy back to staff and essentially said, you need to exclude more areas, particularly higher crime areas, from being prioritized for affordable housing. We're going to come back to the map, but the map is on the right-hand side. Next slide. So essentially what the city did was break all the census tracts in the city into 3 categories. Category 1, high resource opportunity areas associated with positive long-term outcomes for residents. These are wealthier, whiter areas. They tend not to be historically BIPOC communities. Category 2 is everything that is not an opportunity and is not high in poverty and high in crime. And category 3 are areas that have more lowest income folks or have higher crime rates, or both. Next slide. So what the city did was map this onto all the census tracts. That I couldn't figure out how to blow this up any better, so I apologize. But essentially, category 1 is the dark blue. These are the high opportunity areas. Not surprisingly, they're in the west side of the city, and Evergreen and Berry area in the north side. The intermediary blue are the category 2, and then the lighter spots are the category 3. And so you see the patterns. If you know the city, you can probably pick out the different neighborhoods and where the boundaries are. One thing to point out here is that for complicated reasons, all of downtown is category 3. So it becomes the lowest priority in terms of funding, and it has to do with, you know, statistics and demographics. But one of the challenges, and we'll talk about this later, is that maps are static, right? They don't necessarily capture what's happening. And so we know downtown has seen lots of expensive housing being built. And the data for this happens to be data that goes back to 2014. And so it's going to be a real challenge to use the maps as this policy develops. Next slide. So here's the proposal that came to the city. And again, this is the proposed percentage of new city-funded affordable housing. It's actually dollars by these different categories. So in this first phase, they had to acknowledge that there was an existing pipeline, a lot of which they've just dedicated money or are reviewing to dedicate money to. And so category 1, those highest priority areas, we're going to start at 30% of the total, which is more than they've been getting, but we're going to start right away. The category 2, everything else, was going to be at 50%, and then category 3, which are those higher poverty, higher crime areas, which do have a lot of applications for projects in them, we're going to be limited to 20%. As we move through the first 3 to 5 years, and it's unclear exactly how long phase 1 will go, the numbers will shift significantly, so that the priority will really go into the category 1 higher resourced areas. Everybody is on board with creating opportunities in these communities where they haven't historically existed. Let me just make that clear. Next slide. So, but there are some challenges to the siting policy. And so number 1 is that since the council has asked the staff to come back to exclude more areas from being eligible for the bulk of the funding, we run the risk of expanding so much the areas that we've sort of targeted as unworthy or bad places to build housing, that we constrain neighborhood reinvestment through affordable housing development in some of those communities. And so we as a community really need to make sure that we find the right balance without denying affordable housing resources to neighborhoods that could benefit from them. And this is going to be at the center of the struggle when this comes back to council. Next slide. The second challenge is that while we're all on board with trying to create opportunities, the reality is there's a lot of planning work that has to go into creating realistic opportunities for affordable housing development in some of those category 1 areas. A lot of them aren't zoned for high density housing. A lot of them don't have sites that are underutilized. And so council was pretty clear that staff needed to integrate the planning work into the process of adopting the new siting policy. It doesn't do us any good to have lofty goals if we're not willing to commit to doing the work to making them real. So the challenge is that we need to demand that the city can show a commitment to making this work. If we're serious about this, it's going to take planning and land use and community support, as well as just policy language in the housing department. Next slide. So the third challenge is, are we going to come out of this without stigmatizing affordable housing residents or affordable housing or lower income communities? This is a real challenge. The research is very, very clear that affordable housing has a minimal and often positive effect on property values, neighborhood poverty rates, crime rates, and frankly, that these benefits are greatest in lower income neighborhoods. So we need to push back on the folks who should be our allies, but frankly are heading us down potentially an ugly path. So those are going to be the challenges. This is coming back. We're not sure. Again, March, April, everybody's trying to fit into a very, very tight schedule, but it's something I want to make sure people are looking at and looking for opportunities to engage.
Okay, I have a question, and then I think folks in the audience might have questions for you too on this one. This one's, obviously we got somewhat into the technicalities of this potential policy. I'm actually interested in this like challenge number 3 that you called it. Jen already had talked at the top about this increasingly negative atmosphere, and it seems to be related to this in terms of location of affordable housing in certain areas of San Jose. And I feel like, we've been, as a city compared to other cities, at least, pretty pro housing. What is going on?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, the folks that brought this to council, at least one of them just came into office and decided she wasn't going to have any affordable housing in her district. And so this is really a continuation of a resistance to everybody doing their part. And to be fair, there are other places that have been doing less well over the decades. And so, but we're in an ironic moment in which, some of the folks that traditionally would have been resistant are sort of more supportive and more engaging. And some of the folks that have traditionally been supportive are kind of throwing affordable housing under the bus. And it's just a very complicated time. And I think the concern is that in that kind of space, the ability to really talk about facts and truths, as Jen was mentioning on the front end, just becomes very, very complicated because the narrative is emotional, and these people are a burden on our communities. And frankly, we can be better than that as a city and communities. And I work countywide. I hear it. I hear it all the time. In Cupertino and Palo Alto, and these people bring problems with them, and we traditionally have done better in San Jose, but it's clear that we have a long way to go, and we're in a really messy time right now. So I think we really need to stand up and take back control of the narrative in an important way, and I think this policy discussion is a really valuable place for that to happen.
Nadia, and Jen, any thoughts about the kind of like narrative shift? Or, I know I just saw one of your team's articles just today or yesterday, kind of addressing that and kind of trying to shift the narrative, but it feels just like, it's kind of like this scary narrative of like how bad affordable housing is and how our neighborhoods are burdened by affordable housing is being picked up by some of our allies. And
think about what you're saying. Like honestly, the idea that people are saying that affordable housing is bad, that it's too expensive, takes too long. It's like how much it goes back to how much do we really value people? How much should it cost to solve a problem or to provide a resource for someone who is deeply poor, versus how much profit should people make, right? If they own a home and can sell it for $1 million over asking, 200,000 over asking, that seems to be just fine, right? But it seems to be, we seem to get very tense when we want to talk about how much we should be spending. And, when we go back to the lack of affordability, the lack of historical building enough affordability. We have like 30 or so extremely low income homes for every 100 renters. Housing affordability is what's pushing people into losing their homes and pushing people into homelessness. And it's like we have this antidote that can solve it. And we're not only before where it was like hard to get things moved forward into the general public. Now these conversations are happening on the dais, and it is as concerning as I think it can get. Like imagine arguing that we shouldn't be building more affordable housing in the most expensive region in the country. It's a staggering conversation.
I think the other thing to also keep in mind is that when we're making policy decisions or decisions about where housing is located based on stereotypes about people with disabilities, specifically mental health disabilities or race, when it comes to a lot of that narrative around crime and people of color moving in, that's a fair housing violation. And there have been lawsuits when when affordable housing or housing is shot down because of NIMBYism, because of caving into some of these stereotypes, whether it's mental health or violence. We actually, one of my colleagues at the Law Foundation went and looked at all of the 911 calls that apparently allegedly increased as a result of affordable housing. And I think only of the hundreds of calls, there were mostly things like welfare checks and a car alarm going off. Maybe 20 were quote unquote violent or property crimes. And so, I think we really have to be careful that we're not not just violating fair housing laws, but really contradicting this, our goal of affirmatively furthering fair housing, because I think it's a very, it's like a very thin line before we're, before, we potentially are crossing.
And it just feels like, I mean, we know this in the national level too. It's like an untruth can just be said, and then to kind of combat it, it takes a bunch of work. It's like you can just say whatever you want, and then and the people who are like tasked to combat this are nonprofit folk with low resources. So it's just even, well, kudos to your team for looking at that data, because honestly, I think we probably need more of that. Any questions from the audience from our group? We have a couple more topics, but I just want to open it up for a second. All right, we'll keep going. All right, so let's just calm it down a little bit and talk about single family zoning. No, Matthew, you're up again, and we're talking about changes to single family zoning.
Great. So for those of you that have been paying attention, there is a state law, SB 9, that eliminated single family zoning statewide. We will talk about that in a second. And it came midway through a local discussion that was happening, unfortunately, largely on Nextdoor, and it wasn't very constructive, about making some of these changes at a local level that was called opportunity housing. Just for context, the beginning of the local discussion was that 94% of the residential land in the city of San Jose was zoned for single family homes only, and only half of the residents of the city lived in a single family home. Next slide. So opportunity housing, first, just to remind us, and then we can put this to rest, came out of the general plan 4-year review task force, was put on that scope of work by the city council. The task force voted in August of 2020 to explore. This was just going to be an exploration, allowing up to 4 units in single family neighborhoods to focus on citywide community engagement, minimize displacement risks, come up with strategies to preserve historic areas, prioritize urban villages, because that's where the bulk of the housing that we need is targeted to be built, and incentives to include units at affordable or moderately priced levels. So that was what was in process. And while it was waiting to come back to council for action, next slide. We formed a massive coalition. This is just the sort of beginning stages of folks that really thought this was important enough that it needed to be pursued. So I think everybody on this group was a part of that effort. And so we were really ready to have this discussion in good faith, hopefully outside of Nextdoor locally. Next slide. So in July 2021, the legislature passes SB 9. It was signed by the governor in September, and it allows up to 4 units per parcel. It can either be a duplex and a split lot or both. It doesn't allow triplexes or fourplexes, but it's very similar to what the discussion had been. It provides tenant protections, so you can't do a split lot or a redevelopment on a property that's been rented at any point in the last 3 years. It provides exemptions for historic districts. It was supported by every Santa Clara County legislator, and it became effective statewide January 1st. Next slide. So the real question then is, how do we implement SB 9 now that it is the law? And while other cities initially resisted, to its credit, San Jose and the city council, with a vote of 10-1, really embraced the potential of SB 9 rather than figuring out how to throw up barriers. So they passed a placeholder of design standards in December, but they agreed to have a citywide inclusive effort to develop permanent design standards They supported the idea of exploring options in historic districts that would be less detrimental, but would still allow for opportunities in some of those key parts of the cities. Ironically, or not by chance, not by chance, by history, those are some of the neighborhoods that already have a mix of different housing types in the city. They also really importantly said, let's explore existing resources that we have. Let's look for additional programs or policies that could incentivize the inclusion of more affordability in SB9 projects. Let's explore opportunities such as education, technical support, coordination with community development, financial institutions, different lenders to make construction of SB9 homes more accessible, equitable, and feasible. This is by far the strongest statement that came from any city in the state. Next slide. So, next steps. SB9 is the law. Sometimes people ask you, do you support SB9? Do you think it should be? It's the law, right? Some cities have backed off of the initial obstruction. They had passed kind of crazy ordinances, and they realized that they were probably going to lose in court. And so they're coming back and fixing some of those. All the research shows that there are limits to feasibility. It's going to be very gradual over a long period of time. While it is significantly less expensive, the market is still going to produce very expensive housing in Silicon Valley through this program. However, all of this research assumes a developer-driven model. And so part of what the city council asked was, how do we lean in and create new spaces? And the experience we had with ADUs is that they were nothing until we figured out how to come in and really engage and make them possible. And now, you know, there are multiple industries that have developed. There are people that are working with low-income folks that own their home on the east side of the city that don't have the cash to build an ADU, but there are programs now that help facilitate the building of that ADU so that it becomes a source of income, or it becomes a place of reducing overcrowding in those households. And we think there's a lot of potential for SB9 to grow in similar ways, that we can create more models, we can get them into different places, we can find ways of leveraging more affordability. And again, going back to council direction, accessible, equitable, and feasible. So this is going to be happening. The goal is that it's robust and public and citywide. We don't know yet how staff is going to approach it, but please watch, and we'll be engaging folks going forward.
All right, I have a question. I think there's one from the audience too. So, you know, we're kind of talking about like, all right, this is the law and here's how we're going to implement it in all these very detailed ways. And also like, how can we inject some like affordability into this whole concept? But I'm hearing that at least one mayoral candidate is talking about supporting this statewide ballot initiative that would repeal SB9. Does that have any legs, and what are folks doing about that?
You know, the important thing about that ballot measure is that it's pretending that all it's doing is repealing SB9, but it actually repeals everything. It repeals the California Environmental Quality Act if you don't want to apply it locally. It allows you to opt out of this entire RHNA and housing element process that we talked about. It allows you to avoid all of the state streamlining bills that were put in place, all of the different density bonuses. Frankly, these are the tools that San Jose uses, and that because they're happening in other cities are having to do more, the surrounding cities. So ironically, the folks that are pushing this locally are also the ones that have been complaining that neighboring jurisdictions aren't doing their part. And this will actually just be licensed to those bad actors to continue to be bad in ways that they've been looking for ways of being bad for a long time. The good news is it's struggling. People are catching on that it's way more expansive than it was initially pushed, and there are going to be massive unintended consequences. And so it's not getting as much support as it might have. To be honest, though, as Jen said, this is crazy season. truth doesn't make any difference. And so if we can make hay out of people's anxiety and give them a sense of being aggrieved, that's just the way this is going to go. And even though we would like to expect better from our local leaders, we're going to be in that space. So SB 9 is the law. It's a great opportunity. It's the law throughout the state. A lot of cities are actually now starting to be much more constructive, and it's not going to happen fast, but it's going to provide a lot of opportunities in the long run. And it's not the solution to the housing crisis. Let me be clear, that's the other pushback. It's a little tiny part, right? We still need to build a ton of affordable housing at scale to respond to where the needs are the greatest. This has just been a little part of the missing piece, right? That these communities have been so walled off for so long that creating a little bit of an opening is going to have an impact in the long run.
And I think it's another example of how this disinformation, people are hating SB 9 because they think it's going to bring lower income people into their neighborhoods. And so it's even our community, our sector has been used even in something that it has zero requirements to build affordable. But I live in a neighborhood that is a mix of renters. I'm a renter, but also homeowners, and they sent out flyers that were saying that this horrible thing was coming, and it was like it was all wrong. And again, that's the scary part of people with heightened platforms, because they're running for office, are able to say things to people to terrify them, and it's the manipulation is hurting how we think about housing and these things now. But think about in a couple of years, if we want to try to pass a housing bond, Measure A will be spending all of the Measure A money. What will be the sources of dollars we have for building affordable and deeply affordable housing if we're spending the next 12 months having all the voters think that all of this is terrible and it doesn't work. A narrative shift is definitely called for, and I think it's been a struggle to figure out exactly how to approach with, because there's being defensive, but what would it look like to be more on the offense?
Yeah. Okay. I think we just ran out of time for that little bit. I do have a couple of questions in the chat, but they're kind of more global questions, so I'm going to save them right till the end. Nadia, you're going to sing us out. This is our last topic, and it's a challenging one. So can you update us on the eviction moratorium?
Yeah, so I think a lot of you know that there's been some sort of eviction protections. There weren't as broad as an eviction moratoriums in place, both at the local and state levels. And so the state protections, AB 832, the latest version is expiring April 1st. So the good news is that the moratoriums worked in a lot of ways. I mean, they weren't perfect, but a lot of people got rent assistance. A lot of people weren't evicted who potentially without them could have been evicted. We just at our organization saw a 70% reduction in evictions during the time the moratorium in place. And even now there's like this interim protection where, if you pay a quarter of your rent between October and March, that sorry, my kid's here, that you're protected from eviction. And we've been able to stave off just a lot of people who even have gone through the court process just by connecting them to rent assistance and asking the court to dismiss it. So they've been overall really positive. I mean, the bad news is they're expiring April 1st, but we're nowhere out of this crisis. People still aren't able to afford their rent. People are still being COVID impacted. And so, and it doesn't look like the state is going to do anything or pass any stopgap measures. And so, yeah, Jen just put $85 million to close to 200,000 households. Yeah, I mean, it was amazing. The work that has been done. really, I mean, it should be just how we work. It should just be like, if people can access rent assistance, they shouldn't get evicted. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. So in terms of what's next, I think we're hoping, so, you know, I know some of you know that we at the Law Foundation and others have been trying to get the court to do some kind of eviction diversion program. The court implemented a voluntary eviction diversion program with the State Bar's Access to Justice Committee. It was a voluntary program, and unfortunately, as we expected, no landlords really volunteered to participate. And so, you know, like we agreed to provide assistance either through our organization or through volunteer attorneys, and we did maybe like 4 cases. And so our hope is that the court is still looking at potential eviction diversion options, and so our hope is that the court looks at a more robust program that would require participation in mediation like other courts do. It's not looking hopeful that the state will do anything, but we're hopeful, or we're not hopeful, but like we're going to try to see if a local city like San Jose passes some kind of stopgap measure. There's some conversations happening now to see if someone will do something. LA's re-implemented their eviction ordinance. Alameda County has theirs. San Francisco had passed some other protections, and so you know, there could be something happening in the next couple of weeks. Just keep your eyes posted. But yeah, it's not looking great. There's not a ton of good news out there, except that we're going to keep fighting for the families who are facing eviction.
So, I mean, obviously, like, this is whatever it is an uphill battle, but like in an ideal world, what would April 1st look like to you?
Yeah, so in an ideal world, we'd have some kind of stopgap moratorium where, you know, people are still waiting on rent assistance could be prevented from being evicted. In an ideal world, we'd have a court diversion program that would require landlords to mediate, that would have, I mean, the city's eviction help center is in court right now, but have something more robust, which would require landlords to, you know, check to apply for rent assistance or give their tenants the opportunity to do so. And I think just more of a light shined on what eviction court is like. I mean, it's, you know, like, I think that we can do better as a community. I mean, I think there's a lot of bright spots in terms of what we're doing, in terms of some of our work, COPA, some of the things we're talking about today, all of the work that Destination Home does. But I think, unfortunately, our court is not one of those bright spots, and our eviction process is not a bright spot. And so I think there's a lot more that we can be doing as a community to make eviction court better. I mean, there's if you look at Philadelphia, like they have right to counsel there, which means every tenant gets an attorney. But even before you get to eviction court, there's a very robust eviction diversion program where you sit down with your landlord and try to work it out. And so there's a lot of possibility out there, but we just have to really have kind of the political will to be able to do it. So.
Okay, one specific question from on this topic. There's a form of rule that if you apply for rent assistance and you're waiting, you can't be evicted. Is that true? And will it continue to be true after the moratorium?
No, that's so April 1st, that protection ends. Technically, when the landlords sign up for rent assistance, they say that they're not supposed to evict someone. Unfortunately, we're seeing that happen a lot. And so unless the tenant has an attorney, which we think there's about maybe 10% of tenants in our county being represented, you know, they may not be able to assert that defense in court. And I mean, unfortunately, there's a lot of things that the state law required courts to do that our court didn't do or interpreted a different way. So like the court could have been checking to see if a rent assistance application was entered before actually allowing a landlord to bring a case, and the court never did that. So yeah.
Hey, I've got a couple other questions, and one is on a different topic, which is, here's a question. Any thoughts on how to deal with people who supposedly are in favor of affordable housing, but will only support projects with huge, mostly unrealistic BMR numbers? In other words, how can we convincingly convey the affordability of natural affordable housing? Anyone want to tackle that one?
Yeah, so this is a real problem, and some of it is just good faith misunderstanding, and some of it is bad faith. And so we can build at very, very deep levels of affordability, but it takes a city commitment, and it takes public dollars. We can demand a set aside, an inclusionary set aside when market rate housing is built, that a certain proportion of those units be affordable. The reality is that subsidy has to make sense sort of financially with the development of the project. And so in a lot of cities, we see people who just don't want housing to be built saying, oh, we need, 25%, housing for folks with the lowest income in every project that we built. And essentially that's a strategy for stopping housing from being built. So the answer is that there needs to be a sweet spot that leverages as much and as much affordable housing as we can as we build our market rate housing, but nonetheless allows us to continue to build because the demand is increasing, right? Just for context, I know we've all heard this, but we added about 7 or 8 jobs for every housing unit that we built over the last 10 years in Silicon Valley. So we have kind of core structural problems that we've suffered with for decades and generations, but we've also created an environment in which the hole is getting deeper, and the folks that are getting hurt the most are the same folks that were getting hurt before. So we do have a collective responsibility to address the breadth of housing needs we have. And so just telling people nicely that if you ask for too much, nothing will get built. And if it's a good faith interest that they have in expanding opportunities, they'll understand that. And if it's a bad faith interest that they have, then they won't listen to you. So that's not a super difficult one.
Got it. Okay, so this is probably the last question. This is one from our audience, and the question is, how do you maintain joy in your work and integrity, given all the challenge that you shared about, and even the ones that you didn't talk about today? It's a great question. I should have asked it myself.
Well, I will go because even the silence is sad, right? So I think for me, I've been doing this work my whole adult life. And so I've watched the Valley change, watch so many people leave homelessness, so many more people become homeless. And last week I was reminded of something that I wrote 10 years ago when I said, 10 years ago last week that we were going to start this effort to house 100 people that were on the streets, 100. And I remember that time and I thought it seemed like such a big deal. And fast forward 10 years and we've housed over 20,000 people. And so when I think about that, and I think that a small committed group of people really can make big changes, the people that are on this call, all of our colleagues, that gives me joy and hope and sustenance to keep going. But I will say that this election season is a test. It's a test because it shouldn't have to be so hard, right? To just simply do the most basic thing for people, or to allow people to be free from the type of suffering that should be unacceptable to all of us, right? And so I guess maybe knowing that Christmas will come one way or the other, right? I guess is something I'll hold out for. But generally, I think it's the work.
So I know I look really young, but I've been a tenants attorney for 15 years. in this county. And we used to joke around, like, if San Jose passed just cause, like, we could all retire because it was never going to happen. And that happened. That would happen in 2017. And then the state passed it in 2019. I mean, and I just think that, and the fact that we're talking about COPA, like the community actually like taking over property, like things have changed so much for the better in the past 15 years. Like, and I think like I just only have hope for things to get better. I mean, like we actually like the things that we're talking about today, like the opportunity to actually like intentionally address segregation and really empowering community, like that's not, like that's not what we were talking about, like, when I first started as a baby tenants attorney. So I just think that there's a lot of hope, and there's a lot of like there's just a lot of opportunity out there, and so I stay focused on the positive. Like, yes, there's a lot of losses, and all those flyers and newsletters we get are debilitating, but like the work that we've done is just amazing, and like we just can't go anywhere but forward.
So I have bad news. my answer is that the inhumanity and the history of our failure to do right by people and the magnitude of the need in this like obscenely wealthy place that we live, I have rage. And that's what keeps me up at night, but it's also what allows me to get up in the morning. And so I don't know if that's healthy. I can't, but I think honestly, that's what it is. And it also forces me to have the patience to figure out how to be effective. So Jen is the most effective, rageful person I know. I have to figure out how to control that, but honestly, that's what allows me to do the work.
All right, well, on the note of rage, which is where we started and which we will finish. It's good.
Can I change my title? Effective Rage Manager. That'd be good.
We'll ask David Lowe. He's in charge of that. All right, we've come to the end of our time. I thank you to all of your panelists for this amazing, honest, and insightful rundown of current issues in housing policy.